Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Sarah Epprecht. She's the head of delegation of the International Committee for the Red Cross in Armenia. Welcome to CivilNet, Sarah.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure for us. We asked you to come today to talk about a number of issues, primarily about the work that the ICRC does around the world and in Armenia. My first question is, ICRC has worked, it extends humanitarian relief to victims of violence or war-torn zones in conflicts. The nature of warfare in the last several decades has changed with the rise of terrorism, the rise of different tactics. How has the ICRC adapted to those new challenges?
Okay, well, it is true that there have always been situations, armed conflicts, that involve what we call non-state actors. And these are armed groups that do not form a part of a formal army of a state. In recent years, there's been a proliferation of these type of groups, and it makes our work all the more difficult, because the work that we do involves having access to people in the most affected places. So victims of armed conflict, civilians who may be trapped somewhere. And the only way we can get access safely is by having contact with the groups who are in control. And in a situation where you have a proliferation of those groups, and very often the dynamics change as well. They change, the people involved change, the leaders change. And we are confronted with the challenge of identifying who they are, who's in control of what place, and making sure that we have a dialogue with them in order to make sure that we can have access to the people who need it most. And it's very difficult, and it is true that in the last years, this has become more and more of a challenge.
Especially when you try to maintain neutrality in a conflict, it's difficult, I would imagine, when you're dealing with what's going on, for example, in Iraq or Afghanistan, or what we're seeing taking place today in Syria with different armed groups, and you're never sure because they're always changing and their leadership is changing, and they're sort of, so that must be a very, very challenging a role that ICRC has to play.
It's one of the biggest challenges we face today, is maintaining access and being able to deliver the humanitarian relief that we are mandated to deliver under international humanitarian law in situations that are as complex as that.
Sarah, you are in a region that has seen a lot of conflict and frozen conflicts, with the Nagorno Karabakh issue unresolved for the past 20 years since the ceasefire in 1994. And I know that you work extensively with the different state bodies that you need to work with. You work with ICRC in Azerbaijan, I presume, because of the issues that occur, the ceasefire violations that occur on the line of contact. What's interesting to me is, does war rhetoric that oftentimes come from political leaders, or those bellicose statements, when you're trying to create an atmosphere of cooperation, how does that impact your work? I mean, in recent years, we've seen that the leadership in Azerbaijan has been very, very severe in its criticism of Armenian armed forces. How does that affect your work?
Well, it makes it more difficult when in any armed conflict, one of the parties makes public statements that are polarizing. And in a situation where we are trying to work on issues that necessarily require a degree of cooperation or agreement in order to reach a humanitarian goal, this kind of rhetoric can be, let's say, can hinder the achievement of our goals. Now, I think something that is very important to understand is that the ICRC is a neutral organization. So even if there is a lot of rhetoric, a lot of polarization in any conflict, this is the case, we rely on the parties to understand that we are a neutral organization. We don't engage in those kind of polemics. We don't make accusatory statements like in public that would compromise, our neutrality. So this working method allows us to maintain good relations with parties to a conflict. They're able to trust us because they know that you know, we stick to our mandate, we stick to our neutral stand on issues, and that our main focus, our only focus, is to achieve a humanitarian objective. So here, you mentioned the relationship between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Of course, there's a high degree of polarization between the two. We are working on humanitarian issues both here and in Azerbaijan that affect civilian populations. Very particularly, we work on issues related to missing persons, families of missing persons. These families exist both here in Armenia and in Azerbaijan, and the humanitarian issues that these families are facing are the same. So we work with both the Armenian and the Azerbaijani governments on trying to address those concerns, and they know that we are neutral. We're able to play a neutral intermediary role between the two parties, and this is a means by which we can try to achieve these humanitarian aims, even if, you know, there's continued polarization of the sides.
Coming in, that was going to be my next question about the missing persons issue, that oftentimes those families that do have family members who are missing as a result of the Nagorno Karabakh war. 20 years later, the psychological, legal, emotional problems that those families continue to face, and oftentimes we forget about them. We forget about the daily pain and the horror of not knowing what's happened to their son or father or brother or sister, because I presume there are also women who are,
there are some women
in Armenia who are missing. Do you have specific programs to work with the families in Armenia and in Karabakh?
We do. We have our program related to missing persons is basically, it has two components. The first is support to the families. So it's a psychosocial program. We work with the Armenian Red Cross Society and a couple of local partners to try to address some of the psychological and social needs that still exist in among families today, even 20 years later. There are also some legal issues, administrative issues, and through this we call it the accompaniment program. The accompaniers, who are psychologists and other professionals, they work with the families to address some of their needs. And of course there's a very deep psychological component to the work. 20 years of having a missing loved one is something that affects people very deeply, and I think it's important for people to understand that it's a very different kind of suffering that accompanies somebody who's missing a family member than others who also suffer from tragic losses. And it's important that the families of missing get the recognition, because I think, as you said, you know, often there's a lack of recognition or lack of understanding of their situation. And one of the aims of the psychosocial program, the accompaniment program, is to get that recognition for them. So.
You are an international organization and you've worked in probably all of the countries around the world. In terms of practice, you know, I'm wondering, the question where I'm trying to go with this is, what is the role of government here when it has when they have citizens who do have family members who are missing because of a conflict? Are there problems with the legislation? Do national legislations have to correspond with international practice or law if they have signed on to any kind of international treaty? I mean, my question, maybe I should define it more clearly, or if you know the answer, is does Armenia's legislation today address the needs of those families who have missing persons?
Well, okay, there are a couple of ways to respond to that. One is that there are certain measures that Armenia has put in place that address certain needs, but we have also been promoting a specific law on missing persons with the authorities here, and there's been quite an amount of work done on this. The legislation hasn't passed yet. We're hopeful that it will, and we're in close contact with particularly Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defense on this law. And this law is, It would provide certain rights to missing persons. It would also give a degree of that recognition that we were just talking about. So we're hoping that that will pass. And this law is based on the provisions of international humanitarian law and other bodies of law that apply directly to the issue of missing persons in times of armed conflict. And what I didn't mention earlier was the second component of our program, our work for missing persons, and it's a bit related to this, and that is our work with government on not only passage of a law in protecting missing persons, but working on trying to clarify the fate of the missing persons. And I mean, this is the ultimate aim. We do this here and in Azerbaijan as well, and there are state commissions in place on both sides that are tasked with clarifying the fate of missing persons, and we act as neutral intermediary between the two state commissions in order to follow up on lists, on identities, and the ultimate aim would be to provide answers. So we're still on that road, and we hope that one day we will be able to provide answers to families.
I wasn't sure if I was going to ask the question, but I think I'm going to. In the last 20 years, you know, the two state commissions that deal with, you know, prisoners of war and missing persons as a result of the conflict. In the last 20 years, have you been able to go to any family, either in Azerbaijan or Armenia, and say that you've either been able to identify remains, or that you've been able to find that person? I mean, perhaps it's a naive question, because 20 years later, I don't know how these things work. Have you been able to do that?
It's certainly not a naive question. We've had individual cases in the past 20 years of cases being resolved, but they have kind of resolved themselves, where a family member, it turns out, left and went to another country
voluntarily,
and came back. Yes, or the families themselves have been able to work out a way to find out where the missing person has been. More concretely, in answer to your question, we have not been able to go to any families and say, okay, look, we have been able to find out through our work on both sides what happened, and concretely here are remains or not. And I think the work that we are trying to do with the state commissions is to be able to get to that point. And there is broad recognition of the need for that, but we do need to be able to get to the point where both sides are open and willing to look at this issue, which is very sensitive. It can be a very sensitive issue for the parties involved. So it's
You're not there yet.
We're not there yet, but we're hopeful that we can still get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we understand that this is not a story about the Armenians or the Azerbaijanis, this is a humanitarian issue, and the families of missing persons in Azerbaijan and the families of missing persons in Armenia are parents and wives and children, and it's a level of that rises above the conflict, so that there should be the incentive perhaps for those commissions to work together to alleviate the pain of those families.
That's exactly it. Very well put.
One final question. In recent months, we've had several cases of Armenians, particularly in the Davush region, inadvertently crossing into Azerbaijani territory and then being held by the Azerbaijani military armed forces, and then the case of the 77-year-old villager from Verin-Garmarakhbyur in Davush Mars, Mamigon Khojoyan, who after being held in captivity for a month and a half, I think, or 2 months, was returned. Do you get involved in those, I'm assuming, in those cases as well?
We are involved. Our delegation in Azerbaijan visits any person an Armenian who would cross the border,
or vice versa,
whether it's a prisoner of war or a civilian internee. Equally on this side, as you mentioned, if an Azerbaijani individual were to cross over here, our delegation here would be visiting that person. So that is a very important element of our work. We also maintain contact with the families who, you know, are waiting to find out what's going to happen with their loved one who is being detained. And we maintain contact between the family and the person who is held, with the exchange of Red Cross messages. And then when it gets to the point of preparing repatriation, we are a neutral intermediary between the sides in order to organize that. And we are there at the point of handover when the person comes home.
And it does take place on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border, I would assume. You don't.
It takes place on the border. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
The only crossover that ever occurs, probably, in the last 20 years.
Official.
Sarah Epprecht, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to come and talk to us and tell us about the work that the International Committee for the Red Cross is doing. I know it's very difficult work, the mandate that you have to deal with people who are caught, you know, in the crossfire of big politics oftentimes, and they're just ordinary people trying to live and make a living, and then prisoners of war that you also deal with. So thank you very much for coming to CivilNet.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I'd just like to remind our viewers that my guest here at CivilNet was the head of delegation of the International Committee for the Red Cross, Sarah Epprecht. Stay with CivilNet.